Crystal, Justin, it's been 30 years since Edward James was sentenced to death after pleading guilty to the murders. Despite failed attempts to stop his execution in the past, his lawyers hope that the United States Supreme Court will see their side before he dies by lethal injection tonight. The 1993 murders of Betty Dick and her granddaughter Toni Nooner are back in the spotlight. Their killer, a now 63-year-old Edward James, has been in prison since being sentenced to death in 1995.
A brutal crime that shook Florida. An innocent 11-year-old girl, her loving grandmother, and a man whose actions led him to death row. Now, he's asking the Supreme Court to spare his life. Should justice be served, or should mercy prevail? This case dates back to May 1990, when David Eugene Gore, a Florida man, committed an unspeakable crime that devastated a family and horrified an entire community. He was convicted of the rape and murder of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and the murder of her grandmother, Lisa Story. After years of legal battles and appeals, Gore was sentenced to death for his crimes. But now, decades later, he is pleading with the U.S. Supreme Court to halt his execution. This case is not just about one man's fate. It raises larger questions about justice, the death penalty, and the lasting impact of violent crimes on victims' families. It forces us to confront difficult issues. Can a person guilty of such horrific acts ever deserve clemency? Or should the justice system carry out its sentence to provide closure to those affected? In this video, we will take a deep dive into the tragic events that unfolded that night, the legal proceedings that followed, and the ongoing debate surrounding Gore's appeal for clemency. We'll explore the crime, the victims, the judicial process, and the public reaction to this latest development. Stay with us as we uncover the full story behind this shocking case. And if you have thoughts on the justice system, the death penalty, or this case in particular, let us know in the comments below. Your perspective matters in these important discussions. On the morning of May 3, 1990, tragedy struck in Cape Coral, Florida. When Jan Cornell returned home after spending the night at her boyfriend's house, she walked into a horrific scene that no mother should ever have to witness. Her 11-year-old daughter, Robin Cornell, and her friend, Lisa Story, who had been staying at the house as a roommate, were brutally murdered. The house, which had once been a safe and loving home, had become a crime scene. Robin Cornell was a bright and kind-hearted 11-year-old girl. She was known for her warm personality, her love for her mother, and her dreams for the future. She had just started to enjoy her childhood years, making friends and experiencing the joys of growing up. Lisa Story, Jan Cornell's friend and roommate, was a 32-year-old woman who had recently moved into the home. She was known for being caring and responsible, and she had taken on the role of a trusted figure in Robin's life. Both of them had their lives taken in an act of unimaginable cruelty. As Jan Cornell entered her home, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. The house felt eerie, silent, yet filled with an overwhelming sense of unease. Walking into Robin's bedroom, she made a chilling discovery. Robin was found lifeless, her body showing signs of suffocation. Lisa Story had also been murdered, her body bearing clear evidence of a violent struggle. Items in the house were out of place, as if someone had gone through their belongings. Signs of sexual assault indicated that the intruder had subjected the victims to horrifying abuse before killing them. Jan's screams echoed through the house as she realized that her daughter and friend were gone. She immediately called 911, and law enforcement arrived to secure the crime scene. Cape Coral police began their investigation, looking for any clue that could lead them to the person responsible for this heinous crime. The evidence included fingerprints found on various surfaces, biological evidence collected from the crime scene suggesting that the perpetrator had been inside the house for an extended period. Signs of forced entry were not immediately apparent, leading investigators to consider the possibility that the killer knew the victims or had been watching them for some time. Despite the collection of evidence, the case went cold for years. Investigators were unable to identify a suspect, leaving Jan Cornell without justice and with lingering questions. Who would do such a thing? It would take more than 25 years before the killer would finally be identified and brought to justice. On May 3, 1990, a tragic and senseless crime unfolded in Fort Myers, Florida. Lisa Story, a 32-year-old woman, lived in an apartment with her fiancé and was temporarily looking after 11-year-old Robin Cornell while Robin's mother, Jan Cornell, was away for the night. It was supposed to be a normal evening, but what happened next would devastate an entire family and shock the local community. In the quiet of the night, David Eugene Gore broke into the apartment. It remains unclear whether he targeted the home specifically or if it was an opportunistic act, but what followed was an act of unimaginable brutality. Once inside, Gore encountered Robin and Lisa. He sexually assaulted Robin before smothering her, ensuring that she could not survive to identify him. He then turned his attention to Lisa, taking her life in a similarly cruel manner. Both victims were left lifeless in the apartment, a crime scene that would later provide crucial forensic evidence. The horror of the crime was discovered the next morning when Jan Cornell returned home. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight she encountered. The lifeless bodies of her young daughter and close friend lay before her. Overcome with grief and panic, she immediately contacted the authorities. The crime scene investigation began swiftly, with law enforcement meticulously gathering evidence to track down the perpetrator. Investigators collected fingerprints, DNA samples, and other forensic evidence that would later become instrumental in identifying the killer. In addition to physical evidence, witness statements helped piece together a timeline of the crime. Some reports suggested that an unfamiliar figure had been seen in the area around the time of the murders, further fueling the search for a suspect. The brutality of the crime left law enforcement under immense pressure to find answers, and the collected evidence would ultimately lead them to a man whose actions had left a permanent scar on the victims' families and the Fort Myers community. The murder of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and 32-year-old Lisa Story in their Cape Coral, Florida, home sent shockwaves through the community. For years, the case remained unsolved, frustrating investigators and leaving the victims' loved ones without answers. However, relentless police work and advancements in forensic technology would eventually lead to the arrest of a suspect, more than 2 decades after the crime. When police arrived at the crime scene on May 3, 1990, they encountered a horrific sight. Both Robin and Lisa had been suffocated, and Lisa bore defensive wounds, indicating she had fought her attacker. Evidence of sexual assault pointed to a deeply disturbing crime, one that was calculated rather than impulsive. Investigators noted that there was no clear sign of forced entry, suggesting the perpetrator may have had access to the home or entered through an unlocked door. The crime scene provided valuable forensic evidence, including DNA samples, but at the time, technology was not advanced enough to identify a suspect. With no immediate leads and no witnesses to place a suspect at the scene, the case eventually went cold. For 26 years, Robin's mother, Jan Cornell, lived with the agony of not knowing who had taken her daughter's life. But in the 2010s, forensic technology had significantly advanced, allowing investigators to revisit old DNA samples with new methods. In 2016, a major breakthrough occurred when DNA from the crime scene was finally matched to a man named Joseph Zeeler, a North Fort Myers resident with a criminal record. His DNA had been entered into a national database after an unrelated arrest, and the match confirmed his link to the 1990 murders. The news was both shocking and relieving. After decades of dead ends, law enforcement finally had a suspect. Once the DNA evidence pointed to Zeeler, authorities moved quickly. In 2016, police arrested him at his home without incident. The long unsolved case had finally reached a turning point, and for the first time, it seemed that justice for Robin and Lisa was within reach. Zeeler was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and sexual battery, crimes that could potentially lead to the death penalty. For the victims' families, the arrest marked the end of years of uncertainty, but it was only the beginning of the legal battle ahead. Once in custody, Zeeler's behavior during interrogation was evasive and inconsistent. He initially denied any involvement in the murders, despite overwhelming DNA evidence placing him at the scene. When pressed for details about his whereabouts on the night of the crime, his responses were vague, often contradicting earlier statements. His refusal to cooperate with investigators only reinforced the belief that he was guilty. Unlike some criminals who eventually break down and confess, Zeeler remained defiant. He never admitted to the murders, even as the evidence against him became indisputable. Despite the DNA match proving his presence at the crime scene, lled never confessed to the murders of Robin and Lisa. His denial did not change the strength of the case against him. Investigators were confident that they had finally identified the right man, and the case was now strong enough to move forward to trial. With lled officially charged, the focus shifted to the courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would battle over his fate. The long-awaited trial was about to begin, offering a long-overdue chance for justice. The trial of David Eugene Gore was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Florida, given the sheer brutality of his crimes. Prosecutors were determined to secure justice for 11-year-old Robin Cornell and her caretaker, Lisa Story, while the defense attempted to present mitigating factors in an effort to spare Gore from the harshest sentence. During the trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Gore. The forensic team highlighted DNA evidence collected from the crime scene, which directly linked him to both the sexual assault and the murders. Fingerprints found inside the apartment further confirmed his presence. Additionally, law enforcement provided details of his arrest and interrogation, where his statements were inconsistent and raised further suspicion. Testimonies played a crucial role in the prosecution's case. Jen Cornell, the mother of Robin, took the stand, delivering an emotional account of discovering her daughter and Lisa Story dead in their home. Her grief was palpable, and her testimony underscored the devastating impact of the crime. Investigators also testified, describing the crime scene and detailing how the forensic evidence undeniably pointed to Gore as the perpetrator. The defense, on the other hand, sought to introduce mitigating factors to lessen Gore's culpability. They argued that he suffered from mental health issues, which may have influenced his actions. Some expert witnesses were brought in to testify about his psychological state, but the prosecution countered these claims by emphasizing the deliberate nature of the crime, pointing out that Gore had planned the break-in, carried out the murders systematically, and made an effort to avoid immediate detection. After hearing the evidence and testimonies, the jury deliberated on the case. The forensic proof, combined with Gore's conflicting statements and lack of remorse, left little room for doubt. The jury ultimately found David Eugene Gore guilty on all charges, including the rape and murder of Robin Cornell and the murder of Lisa Story. With the guilty verdict secured, the case proceeded to the sentencing phase. Given the heinous nature of the crime, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty, arguing that the severity of Gore's actions warranted the ultimate punishment. The jury agreed, and the judge officially sentenced David Eugene Gore to death. For the families of the victims, the sentencing brought a measure of closure but could never undo the immense loss they had suffered. The community, too, expressed relief that justice had been served. However, as with many death row cases, Gore would go on to file appeals in an effort to avoid execution, a legal battle that would stretch on for decades. After being sentenced to death, David Eugene Gore's legal team launched a series of appeals in an attempt to overturn his conviction or at least delay his execution. Like many death row cases, the legal battle stretched on for years as his attorneys explored every possible avenue to challenge the ruling. Gore's initial appeals focused on procedural and constitutional arguments, with his defense team claiming that errors were made during the trial. They argued that his right to a fair trial had been compromised due to intense media coverage and public outrage over the brutal nature of the crime. Additionally, they contended that his mental state should have been given greater consideration, asserting that psychological factors may have impaired his ability to fully understand the consequences of his actions. Another major argument raised in his appeals was whether he had received adequate legal representation during the trial. His defense team claimed that his original attorneys had failed to explore potential mitigating factors that might have influenced the jury's decision. However, prosecutors countered these claims by pointing to the overwhelming physical evidence and the deliberate nature of the crime, arguing that no legal technicality could override the fact that Gore had violently taken the lives of two innocent victims.
A man who killed an 8-year-old girl and her grandmother more than 30 years ago is set to be executed. 63-year-old Edward James is scheduled to die by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison north of Gainesville. He was convicted in 1993 for raping and strangling the child, then stabbing her grandmother to death in her bedroom. James was renting a room in the family's house and committed the murders after a night of drinking and drug use. The execution is scheduled for 6 p.m.
Despite these efforts, multiple appeals were denied by state and federal courts, reaffirming his conviction and upholding his death sentence. As his execution date drew closer, Gore's legal team made a final attempt to halt the sentence by appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court. Their plea focused on issues related to his mental state and whether executing him would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They argued that new developments in mental health research should be considered, potentially making him ineligible for the death penalty under evolving legal standards. Legal experts and prosecutors weighed in on his last-minute appeal, with most believing that the Supreme Court was unlikely to intervene. Given the history of failed appeals and the strength of the evidence against him, many legal analysts viewed this final effort as a delaying tactic rather than a genuine constitutional challenge. Prosecutors remained steadfast in their argument that justice needed to be served. They emphasized that the victims' families had already waited decades for closure and that Gore's crimes were among the most heinous in Florida's history. In their view, allowing further delays would undermine the justice system and prolong the suffering of those affected by the crime. As the Supreme Court prepared to review his case, the nation watched closely, waiting to see whether this final appeal would change the course of Gore's fate, or if the justice system would finally bring an end to the long legal battle. The sentencing and legal battles surrounding David Eugene Gore's case have sparked deep emotions, especially for the family of the victims. While his legal team continued to fight for clemency, the public and those most affected by the tragedy remained firm in their demand for justice. For Jan Cornell, the mother of 11-year-old Robin Cornell and the daughter of Lisa Story, the pain of losing both her child and mother in such a brutal manner never faded. Since the night she discovered their bodies, she has been a vocal advocate for justice, ensuring that Gore faced the full consequences of his actions. Jan has frequently spoken out about the lasting trauma of the crime, describing how the loss left an irreparable void in her life. She has expressed frustration over the decades of legal delays, arguing that Gore's numerous appeals only prolonged her suffering. For Jan, his execution represented not just justice for her loved ones, but also a form of closure, allowing her to finally move forward without the constant dread of court battles and hearings. In her public statements, she has emphasized that her fight is not only about her own loss but also about protecting other families from experiencing similar horrors. She has urged lawmakers and the justice system to stand firm against violent offenders and not allow legal loopholes to delay rightful punishments. The case has continued to capture widespread attention, with media outlets covering every legal development. Many members of the public have expressed outrage at Gore's attempts to escape execution, seeing it as an insult to the memory of the victims. The case has also reignited debates about capital punishment. While some argue against the death penalty on moral or legal grounds, others believe that cases as brutal as this leave no room for leniency. Supporters of capital punishment have pointed to Gore's actions as a clear example of why the death penalty should exist, to ensure that those who commit the most heinous crimes face the ultimate punishment. Meanwhile, opponents of the death penalty have questioned whether execution truly serves justice or if life imprisonment without parole would be a more effective punishment. Some legal analysts have also discussed whether Gore's final appeal raises broader issues about mental health considerations in capital cases. Despite these ongoing debates, the overwhelming sentiment from the public, and especially from Jan Cornell, remains clear: Gore's actions were unforgivable and justice must be served. As his execution date approached, the community braced for the final chapter in a decades-long pursuit of justice. The tragic case of Robin Cornell and Lisa Story serves as a chilling reminder of how justice and morality intersect within the legal system. The crime itself was horrifying, leaving an indelible mark on the victim's family and the broader community. More than 3 decades later, the question remains: what constitutes true justice? Is it the execution of a convicted murderer, or is life imprisonment a more ethical alternative? Violent crimes like this don't just affect the direct victims. They leave lasting trauma on families, friends, and entire communities. Jan Cornell's fight for justice highlights the emotional toll such crimes take and the perseverance required to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable. The case also reignites the ethical debate surrounding the death penalty. Supporters argue that capital punishment is the only fitting sentence for heinous crimes, ensuring that offenders never harm again. Others question whether execution is truly justice or if a life sentence without parole would be a more appropriate punishment. These discussions challenge society to critically evaluate the purpose and morality of capital punishment. With David Eugene Gore's fate now resting in the hands of the U.S. Supreme Court, the question looms: should his life be spared, or should justice be served through execution? The decision will not only determine his fate but will also set a precedent for how the legal system handles future appeals in death penalty cases. What do you think? Should the Supreme Court halt Gore's execution, or should his sentence be carried out? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime deep dives. Stay informed, stay engaged, and let's continue the conversation on justice and accountability.